Everyone in life sooner or later has an event that changes everything, turns life upside down. For some people, it happens unnoticed. Only after looking back, assessing the retrospective, they say that that event became fateful for others. The situation is clear. At that moment, something happens, and everything is immediately clear. The former life is over, and it is impossible to turn back. Nancy, it was immediately clear it was the end of consciousness. A complete catastrophe happened immediately on the spot. There were no illusions or acts of self-deception. The young man was no coward. He knew how to face the truth, pull himself together, and start acting. Nothing could knock him out of his rut. By that fateful moment, which divided Nancy's life into the before and after, he was already married to Molly. Almost 5 years, a happy young family, as is the norm nowadays. Career came first, but they dreamed of more. They wanted to live a little more for themselves, to accumulate material and moral resources, and to start adding to the family. It was simply believed that this step should be conscious, deliberate. You can't. The question of childbearing is solved by a rush. This does not benefit either the parents or the future baby. It will be better if the appearance of a new member will be planned and carefully prepared. And now, the young couple continued to live in their own pleasure as long as they could. All in good time. Why hurry? It is necessary and youth to enjoy each other's freedom. Here, the partners' views were in complete agreement. Both Nancy and Molly want to be outdoors without burdening themselves with unnecessary cares. They looked at friends and acquaintances who had already had offspring, and, talking to each other, came to one for two. The conclusion is that they are not ready yet. It is necessary to wait a little longer. As it turned out later, it was precisely the time they had very little. Man is so selfish that he always thinks he has everything ahead of him. Something bad happens to others, but it won't happen to him personally. He will always be happy and healthy, and all adversity will bypass him, it seems to a person. That he is the happy exception. Such thoughts visit everyone, until life will not put everything in its place before the first disaster that will break these rose-colored glasses, glass inside. While fate brought the sword of Damocles over the fates of lovers, they lived and did not even imagine what awaits them. What vicissitudes of life await them around the corner? Oh, happy human ignorance. Could it be for the best? People who are anxious and constantly waiting for trouble don't live well either. Be that as it may, it's a road everyone chooses for himself. And this little family chose their own way too. They lived quietly, enjoying every day, not to grieve about anything. They're sure they'll continue to do so, basically no different from any other of her age couple their age. When you're young, you can't do anything. This particular weekend didn't stand out at first. As usual, Nancy and his wife decided to have a good vacation. Why spend the weekend lying on the couch? Such leisure will be enough in old age. Now, while there is such an opportunity, you should try to draw as much as possible new sensations, adventures, and experiences. You'll need something to remember in your old age. It was a hot summer. God said to go somewhere and have fun. And there was social foot. But then, there was a chance they were invited to a housewarming party in the city. Finally, the house was finished. What better reason to get together and celebrate? It was supposed to be noisy, fun, ideal. What can be better than a summer vacation in nature, in good company? Huh? Near the river, shashliks were planned. A dream. That's why the couple and, without hesitation, made a decision when there will be such a splendid opportunity. In their dacha residence, they did not have yet. The day was just wonderful, cheerful, loud, joyful. So many positive emotions. It was already late in the evening, and the hosts began to poll the guests to decide who would stay. I mean, there were guests to be accommodated. And then suddenly, Molly started teaching me that she wanted to go back to town today. Oh, come on, honey. Her husband tried to reason with her. "We had originally planned to stay. I changed my mind," she countered. Why? What's wrong? Nancy was genuinely perplexed. After all, everything is so wonderful. We had a great time. And tomorrow we'll go to the river in the morning, have another swim. Why return to the stuffy, dusty city? I don't want to sleep here. I want to go home. Nancy realized that his resistance and arguments were completely untenable. His wife was horny. He knew firsthand what that meant. There were only two options left. One, he agrees. They do what she wants. The second one, they fight, they scandalize. They have a long talk. But they still have to give up. So there's no constructive response. Kid, when was the last time you decided to try? Man, I just don't want to, and that's it. That's not enough. Molly was starting to get angry and turned on. Of course, my own desire is of no interest to anyone. Quietly, almost under his nose, muttered dissatisfied Nancy. His wife's behavior pissed him off, especially the way it was going. I've been caught in the tail, and now it's urgent to do as she wants. It seemed to Nancy that he even knew the real reason for such fierce resistance to his spouse. Banal female envy. By the edge of his ear, he heard a little sprinkling of his Molly and a few other young ladies. The cause of the conflict was complex, vulnerable, and only available for full comprehension to persons of the female gender. But the tone turned abruptly cold. After another round of bragging to each other, someone Molly had overplayed her hand. Obviously, now she's not happy, to put it mildly. All right, let's go. The spouse has gone to the meeting. You do realize you're gonna have to drive. I've had a few drinks, but that's more than enough for a disaster. No problem, I'll drive. I haven't had a drink at all, my wife said cheerfully. It was all about getting out of here as fast as possible. But you realize that you will have to go on the highway, that it is dark, and that you drive. Are you like this? Nancy appealed to his common sense. He had believed to the last minute that logic would kick in. But no, Molly was absolutely adamant. Apparently, the conflict was more serious than it appeared at first glance from the outside. I drive fine. I can handle it. You don't have to worry so much. The wife was starting to get angry. Nancy had no choice. I had to forcefully submit to someone else's will. I was seething with anger inside. What's the use? A public scandal? Yes, but it would be better to discuss today's events tomorrow with a fresh, sober head. Talking now won't do any good. Saying goodbye, thanking the owners of the house, the couple loaded into the car and headed for home. The way was not close third of their night. Nancy sat on the passenger seat while the spouse drove the car. He must have dozed off? Yes, he probably was.
It was as if the man had been jerked out of some kind of oblivion. It was abrupt, confusing, and in a second. Here they drive away from the gate of the house of friends. Here they drive out of the gate of the cottage village.
Then the gluing fails. And here, Nancy opens his eyes at the shrieking and wild roar of his spouse. There was also a muffled but sensitive blow on the car body. Or had he dreamed it? At first, Nancy didn't even realize what had happened.
He looked around him and tried to grasp the reason for stopping such an inadequate reaction from Molly. He was oriented by the red stains on the windshield. It was obviously blood. Moreover, the glass itself was badly cracked. One might even say it was shattered, since there were small shards in the cabin as well. Molly was sitting next to her, slamming her eyes shut and screaming frantically. Makeup and tears were smeared on her cheeks. God, Molly, what happened? He tried to get at his wife, but she only cried and did not react to external stimuli in any way. That must have been her shock. After a while, Nancy goes over this moment many times in his mind and could not understand his reaction as well. Why had he asked those questions? Why didn't he get out of the car right away? He was probably under stress himself. You're hurt. You hit yourself. Molly, are you okay? He tried to shout to his wife. There was no response to his cries. So Nancy decided to get out of the car and see what was going on outside. To be honest, it was just terribly scary. He was afraid of the sight that might appear before him. But there was no way out. One had to get up and take responsibility. Molly was clearly incapacitated at this minute and unable to perform conscious actions. As soon as Nancy got out, looked around, he immediately realized matters were very bad. All the worst fears and assumptions of the man, which he had managed to fantasize to himself, were instantly confirmed. Behind, about 7 or 8 meters from the rear hood of the car, lay a man. Obeying an impulse, Nancy almost ran towards the victim. But at close quarters, the picture was clear. There was no one left to help. The man was dead. There was no doubt about it. The body looked so gruesome that there was no point in trying to feel for a pulse or check for breathing. It was all over. The blow had been too strong. The man was probably not very pleasant in appearance, and there was even now a horrible odor wafting from him. He was probably of no fixed abode, as it is customary to say in our tolerant age. This nonsense was spinning around in Nancy's head, probably the effects of shock. What the hell did it matter who the victim was and what was his correct name? What mattered was that he was dead, but it was very difficult to concentrate on the main thing. What to do now? Nancy asked aloud to himself. His Molly continued to sit in the car and cry. He could hear even now that annoying sound. A deserted road at night, no one around. And dead people. Since there was time, Nancy decided to at least try to grasp for himself how it had happened. He ran over to the driver's door and yanked on Molly. Molly, wake up! Hajuro 3 Aosui. His wife by the shoulders, but nothing was helping. She was hysterical. Molly, he's dead. Do you hear how it came out? No response. And it seemed that such a crude form of interrogation only served to further short-circuit the spouse. Nancy left her and returned to the injured man. He stared silently, trying to piece together a coherent picture in his mind, looking at the prospect of the road, at the car, at the injured man. His position. Was she speeding, or did she just not see him? The road seemed pretty well lit. How did this even happen? Giving up on trying to get to the truth himself and get through to his wife, Nancy did what he should have done a long time ago. For Nancy, there was no question. He was certain of the need to call the police, the ambulance. There wasn't even the idea of hiding, of trying to hide the injured man. It hadn't occurred to him. It was all his fault. He had to take the blame. Although it wasn't his fault as such. But Molly, but what could he do? Cover for her. Flee the scene as if nothing had happened. Absurd. To him, such behavior was unthinkable, unacceptable. That was why Nancy had called and reported what had happened. Now all that was left to do was wait. Could things still have turned out all right? I really wish it could. But judging from the picture, it was unlikely. It was clearly the fault of the driver of the vehicle. In this particular case, his wife. Having done his civic duty, Nancy stood with his back to the car, looking at the victims and wondering what would happen next. Was it him that much deeper into himself, or was his spouse so quiet and unnoticed? He didn't even hear her creep up from behind. So her voice from behind him startled him out of his surprise. What's going to happen now? Am I going to go to jail? Goalless, overcome with anxiety, and just starting to get hysterical? Molly asked. I don't know, honey. I don't even know what happened. I slept through the whole thing. Woke up to a rumble. Sympathetically stretched the husband. He was terribly sorry, Molly. But what could he do in this situation? It seemed like there was no way out. I'm dead in there. But you understand, the wife was already shouting. It was as if she hadn't heard her husband's answers, his words, or didn't want to hear them. She was now completely focused on herself and her future. You imagine me in the zone. I'll be a dirty stove. The psychosis seemed to be taking hold of his wife again. Nancy didn't know what to do or what to say. He felt so sorry for her, but he felt sorry for the man who had been hurt too. Could it be allowed that no one would be held responsible for his death? That was all. That train had already left. After all, Nancy called a return next hall and reported what had happened, or gave his details to the kid. What am I supposed to do? I'd say I was driving, but I'd been drinking. Can you imagine the kind of jail time I'd be looking at if I found out? I'll be in jail until I get a carrot. A pig! It seemed absurd, but on an inner impulse, Nancy was ready to take the blame. Except that it seemed unconstructive. I won't get over it, Molly cried. I'll just kill myself. And I won't sit down. Please do something, eh? He tried to frantically think, but there was no way out to take the blame. It was the truth. His favorite women made him change his mind. Of course, he didn't want to go to the zone. He didn't want to be responsible, especially for someone else's crime. But if the choice was so radical, he couldn't let anything happen to Molly. Sighs. Okay, all right. Nancy interrupted his wife's next scene. I'll say I was driving myself. What was my fault? I hit a pedestrian, beat him up. At that second, the Himalayas literally fell off her shoulders. Here he was, Nancy, taking on a heavy burden that now has to be carried on his shoulders. Really? Wiping away her tears, the woman still couldn't believe she could get off so easily. She couldn't believe her husband would take it all on. Nancy, you won't make up your mind. No, it's settled. Her husband firmly reaffirmed his decision. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'll never forget this. I'm not leaving you. The wife's emotions changed dramatically, but their wave, the imagery from stress, was still frightening. All right, let's talk it over. Tell me how it was. We have very little time. We have to completely converge on the testimony.
Nancy had already in these minutes accepted fate, accepted responsibility, and humbly prepared for the worst. Now the main thing was that the blow should come only on him, so that his beloved would not be affected. Otherwise, what was all this for?
In principle. From that moment, from that second, when it was decided to take the guilt of his wife upon himself, Nancy's life was completely changed, turned upside down. Even in the evening, leaving the hospitable house of friends,
the man was as successful in his career office plankton. And now, what would happen next? There was no doubt that for a fatal accident in a state of alcoholic intoxication, we'll have to answer strictly, we'll have to serve a sentence in the colony.
This Nancy took immediately as a given. All he could do to help himself was to cooperate with the investigation, admit guilt, and be ready to compensate for the harm he had caused by his crime. Then one could expect some leniency from the court. Without bemoaning the ICC, the man took it as a given. Now, he is not just a citizen. He now has a special status. He is now a criminal defendant and faces a substantial prison sentence. Nancy fundamentally did not want to build illusions and draw rosy castles for himself. No, he was preparing for the worst. It would be better to be happy with the court's decision later than vice versa. He wasn't ready to hope and lose. What was at stake was not a lottery ticket, but his life. When the stakes are this high, losing could kill. Yes, he'd chosen this path for himself when he suggested his wife take the blame. Did he regret it now? No. You have to know Nancy. He's not the kind of man who's going to lay his head in ashes. And that's eminently sensible. Really, what's the point? Like any normal person, he felt sorry for himself for having to go through this. Yes, but it's a perfectly natural reaction. Who doesn't love themselves enough not to feel sorry for themselves? He'd feel more sorry for Molly if she had to go through this. He could see now that life under investigation wasn't sugar. Nancy chuckled to himself. He felt as if he were the main character from the movie Station for Two.
After all, their stories were almost identical. Before the trial, before the verdict, the investigator left Nancy on his own recognizance.
I realize you won't escape, so I don't see the point in locking you up. Will you be able to make it? Honestly confess the captain. What should I prepare for? Straightforwardly, ask the prisoner, hoping for the truth.
I can't imagine the will of the judge. One thing I can say for sure is that you must come to the court with your things. There is no doubt that you will have to go to the colony. From that moment on, dreams and fantasies were shattered for good. Although even before that, Nancy is not much enchanted by the prospect of conditional imprisonment. Despite the assurances of the lawyer, the man was ready. And that's fine, because he didn't have that readiness. Hell knows how he would have coped, how he would have survived. The court's verdict wasn't as soft as he'd been promised, rather the opposite. The defendant was sentenced to 5 years in prison. From the courtroom with his belongings, he went to a general regime colony. Naturally, a huge, colossal role in this was played by the fact that the forensic medical examination and primary examination proved the presence of alcohol in the driver's blood. This is another crime, not just an aggravating circumstance. The more so that shortly before the incident, the legislator just went for a strong course of responsibility for this kind of crime. All of which played against Nancy. He was credited with cooperation with the investigation, attempts to help the victim, although he never realized it. There was no help at all. Poor guy died right away. Nevertheless, that may be how the call for medical assistance is credited. A favorable impression of the defendant was also formed due to his behavior, both during the investigation and at the trial. The judge felt it was a fair punishment. Who can argue with that? Who's to judge? There is a very sad consequence of a man dead. Whatever he may have been in life, he's a human being first and foremost. Hand on heart, Nancy himself thought the verdict was fair. If he were the judge, he would have imposed plus or minus the same sentence. There was no resentment against anyone. The man took everything that was going on as a given, tried not to bury or evaluate if it was possible. Molly was by her spouse's side the whole time and was very supportive of him. Truthfully, they never talked about the incident again, from the perspective that she was behind the wheel. They pretended that they'd blotted it out of their minds. But it does her credit that she never thought of turning her back on her spouse.
Secretly, Nancy had assumed that was a possibility. Not at all. He was no fool and had accepted that option in advance. And immediately all the consequences associated with it.
But no, Molly did not think of leaving her husband. She was doing everything she could to help him. So one warm and beautiful summer evening, the whole life of a man turned upside down and flew upside down. Now, as they say, he had a long road ahead of him. And a state house. Unfortunately, this forecast was not a metaphor. It was a harsh reality of life, which it was better to accept at once. However, as it turned out, it was also possible to live in the colony, and not just to languish and exist. Not everything was as dreadful as it seemed to Nancy at first sight. In the first week of adaptation, it is, in itself, a place of imprisonment, a punishment for the guilty person. There's no way this place has the conditions of a sanitarium or a children's camp. Nevertheless, neither is a picture from horror movies. And the people, most importantly, what struck Nancy most of all, they are different, just like in the wild. Completely different. All kinds, but for the most part calm, normal, and adequate. there were no cases of some kind of brutal hazing. For some reason, that's what the man was most afraid of. Probably stories of people who had served in the army and shared horrible experiences played a role here. Nancy hadn't served, and it was uncharted territory for him. That's why it was so frightening. The judge gave him a general security colony. That stay wasn't harsh, and there weren't even hardly any people you had to avoid a kilometer away. They were walls, characters which frightened from off the TV screens. There were almost no here. The main contingent is peaceful, calm, who wants to get out quickly with fewer losses. Actually, almost everyone tried to avoid problems and dangerous situations. Surprisingly, the days flew quickly. Still on the outside. When Nancy reasoned about it, he thought that the term would seem unbearably long. But no, the convicts were subject to a strict schedule. There was always something to do. There was no boredom. That's why the time from the booth to bedtime ran fast. It turned out that the prisoners were allowed not only visits and letters, but also calls through a special telephone. A luxury. Whenever possible, Nancy called his mother and wife. Mom was much more difficult to talk to. Her heart ached unbearably for her. An old woman, how is she coping with this blow? Nancy had tried to prepare her for this when he was still at large. But how is that possible? How are you doing there, son? Asked the same questions Betty always asked. Are they hurting you? It's all very civilized around here. Don't believe the news and stupid TV shows. People are normal, some of them even good, shared Nancy. Better tell me, how did you, Molly? Come. Does it help you? Yeah, she did. She's not worried about me. I'm doing fine. Then don't worry about me. I know your heart's racing. Don't be like that. It won't do any good, my son warned me. When you have children, you'll understand me. You can't stop worrying, no matter how old they get. Betty came to the rescue. I hope I'll know very soon, smiled Nancy. God willing. Take care of yourself, son. These conversations were never easy. He could feel how hard it was for his mother, how she was having a hard time coping, what to do to help her. There was no answer, of course. The husband called Molly quite often, too. She never thought of leaving him. As soon as there was an opportunity, as soon as the deadline approached, she immediately came for both short and long visits. She would send her husband a large amount of transmissions. There was nothing to grumble about. For her part, her spouse did everything to facilitate Nancy's life and existence in the colony, supported him morally. She told him how much she waited for him and missed him. It was interesting. Did she feel guilty? Most likely, even for sure. Though in general, Nancy tried to forget about that fateful episode on the road. Tried not to think about the fact that he had taken the blame from his wife. Didn't want to remember it. He was afraid that then he would start blaming Molly for his problems. And he didn't want that. He was the one who suggested and implemented it. Then what's the problem? Loved ones like you. Molly was genuinely concerned. It's okay. You don't need to worry that it's the same as always. I live, I wish, I go to work. In 2 weeks, I'll come to you for a long visit. We don't know how the head of the colony signed off on it. We haven't been told. You'll get a call in advance, but there are no claims and complaints against me, so they are unlikely to refuse, the prisoner said. Good. I miss you so much. I want to see you so much. I just can't stand it, Molly said with a gasp. Me too, but it's just a little while longer.
Be patient, my dear. You almost forgot, Molly. Don't forget to tell me what to cook, what to take with you. Okay? The wife came to her senses. Dates? Just come yourself. He smiled. Everything else is not important to me, but I really want you to eat delicious home-cooked food.
So you should definitely think about it.
Betty threatened to serve your favorite fried pies with cabbage on the stove.
Sounds like fun. Molly, as she says she is fine, but her voice is very sad. As sick? Badly, Nancy was worried. No, more like misses you. She wants to see you, you know. I talked to them for hours after a date, recounting everything in little nuances. I hope it's all good. The husband's worried. Naturally. We've talked about it 100 times, and I'm not an idiot. Only positive attitude, only good news. Yeah, well, there's no bad news. You can't keep anything from me, though. Molly got scared. No, of course not. I'm a deprived person. Let her think it's like a children's camp. It'll make everyone feel better. That's the picture I'm painting, telling you that you're full and you're in the air a lot. That's good. The prisoner nodded contentedly. All this was hard. The forced separation from his mother was hard. She could not come to him for health reasons. And she didn't need to. Cages, convoys, dogs, barbed wire. Who needs such adventures in their old age? No, she'd rather listen to Molly, the light version. So slowly, little by little, time rolled on. I couldn't believe it was so far behind me, huh? For some reason, Nancy remembered best his first day in the colony when they were brought into quarantine. He had been stiff and frightened by the surroundings. Now everything was familiar, like home. What a beast man gets used to everything. It's amazing to observe such phenomena on one's own skin. It's been a little over 2.5 years, halfway to the equator. How had Nancy waited for this? Now it was time to get the paperwork together and apply for parole. At last, the enthusiastic man saw himself at liberty, imagined what he would do, where he would go. Meeting with his mother, it can be said that every day of his imprisonment, he worked to be released as early as possible. Certainly had the prisoner tried to behave perfectly every single day. Sorsper. This is not a formality. This behavior depends on the decision of the colony administration. In the petition of the convicted person, it was necessary to get the consent of the management, their authorization, in order to go to court and have such an opportunity. All the information reflected in the personal file could play a role in the decision at any stage. Loyal attitude of the staff of the institution also meant a lot. Here, Nancy was trying his best not to spoil relations with anyone. The cost of a mistake was too high. Unforgivable? As it soon turned out, it was all for nothing. The labor was more than worth it. First, the administration without problems and delays went to meet the prisoner, and then the court granted his petition to replace not serving part of the sentence. No way. It's done. Nancy cheered like a child. Naturally, he'd been coming to this for so long. Now he couldn't even believe that everything was real, that it wasn't a dream. Here, all Nancy's stars and his personality had come together. He was characterized always and by all, only in a positive way. The fact that the crime was not intentional, committed unintentionally, recklessly. The fine that the court additionally imposed, Nancy paid long ago. That's also very important. Also, the judge was probably a woman who was perceptive. Molly was pregnant with twins. It's good that the spouse had time to provide a certificate to the colony administration. It was a good thing. Nancy wouldn't say why. He even had to lie about it. He said it was for long visits in the future. It was embarrassing and shameful to lie. But the prisoner did not want to tell any of his family and friends anything about this trial in advance. Of course, he feared the collapse of expectations. Why should his sick mother and pregnant wife go through such stress? It is completely unnecessary. Especially since nothing depended on them. They could not influence this decision. Then why? To have someone to discuss it with? No way. He's got a whole barracks of men for that. That was one side of the coin of fear and worry. The other side was the anticipation of what if it works out? What a surprise it would be. Nancy anticipated the surprised faces of his wife and mother. How happy they would be to see him. How could it be otherwise? They love him and are waiting for him. Here are the documents in hand, and the day has already been set when he will be released. As they say, with a clear conscience, it is terribly hard to hide this news and his joy. But he is holding on from the last strength. There's only a little bit of patience left. And what will be the effect? The day before his release, Nancy spoke to his wife. "Nancy, I'm going into labor," Molly said. "Oh my God, what's wrong? How are you? How are the kids? Is everything okay? Or is there some kind of threat?" Nancy started to panic immediately. No, the doctors are just being cautious. "The babies are big. It's hard for me to walk," my wife explained. "But it's only 30 weeks. Isn't it a little early for them to be born?" "Yes, in principle, they say that no, not critical. I would like to walk longer, but it is as God wills. In pregnancy and childbirth, as the house as they say, everything is always unpredictable. It is simply impossible to guess in advance how it will be. Then, of course, it is better to be under the control of a doctor all the time. You never know. Agreed, husband? That's what we're talking about?" We decided with my gynecologist, I will wait for your calls in the evenings and keep you informed. Don't worry about it, Molly promised. Nancy only smiled slyly. He knew that there would be no call tomorrow. With any luck, he would be at the maternity hospital with his wife by lunchtime. All night he did not sleep, could not sleep, all worried about Molly. How she was there, how the children. Was everything all right? God, it's so good that things are working out this way. I'm going to be there for them at this moment. It's so hard to be far away and not be able to help, Nancy reasoned. At 10 foot, he was released outside the colony. It was just like in the movies. The sun was shining in his face, and it felt like the whole world was rejoicing with him. And how happy he was, just incredibly elated with his thoughts of his wife and children. A former prisoner literally flew to the hospital. He was lucky that the colony was nearby, in the region. All he had to do was take an electric train. And there it was, his hometown. It seemed that nothing had changed around.
But on the other hand, as if everything was new. Trying not to pay attention to the situation, Nancy rushed to the right address and prayed that he would catch his wife in the ward, with children in her belly. He didn't want them to be born without him. He wouldn't be allowed into the operating room, but at least he'd be there for them. Daddy's gotta be there for him. When are his babies born?
Nancy jumped on the subway right off the train so he wouldn't be late. He knew for sure it would be faster than waiting for a cab. He only made 2 stops on the run to buy water. He was dying of thirst and to go to the flower shop. How could he go to his wife's maternity ward without flowers? It's a real crime. The woman you love should make pleasant surprises. Although, of course, his very appearance is already a huge surprise, but he didn't want to stop. He ran, afraid of being late for the building. He literally flew in and went straight to the information desk. Hi, excuse me? Can you tell me where Wilson is? She pregnant? Misty Sis threw the strange visitor a glance from head to toe. But apparently, such nervous dads flew in here several times a day. Good afternoon. Is that right? Wilson Molly, right. Yeah. Barely choking, confirmed Nancy. Yeah, found the maternity ward, 3rd floor, room 16 on the left. Thank you. The satisfied man threw over his shoulder on the run. When the wait for a date with his wife was reduced to a few minutes, the heart in his chest literally froze. Catala, it literally wanted to burst out. So much booze. The excitement was just incredible, cosmic. The man was absolutely unbelievably happy. I'm not sure I'd ever felt such emotions before. Nancy genuinely felt as if life was finally getting better. He overcame all the obstacles, went to great lengths for his family, sacrificed himself. And here it is, the reward. Now what is there to fear? What is there to be afraid of? He has served his sentence. Now Nancy is free. He is about to meet his beloved woman who has waited for him, who is about to bear him the children they dreamed of and planned so many years ago when they first met and began dating. They already knew then that they would be together, that they would get married, and that they would have children. True, they did not know what path awaited them, that it would not be so simple and easy. But now the past turned out to be such nonsense. After all, it is the past, and only a happy future lies ahead. It's already here, just hold out your hand. With these thoughts, Nancy was going up in the elevator to the 3rd floor. Impatience could be read even in the way he stood. He should have run up the stairs. He chided himself. Yes, right now, even seconds, fractions of a second mattered. After such a long wait, there was no strength to endure, and so the elevator doors opened on the desired floor. In front of the man's eyes was the sign for the maternity ward. Somehow the nurse had pointed to the left. Yes, the man remembered. It turned out that it was necessary to turn down a small corridor. And then the man, who had been running and hurrying all the way, suddenly froze with surprise. Of course, he couldn't be mistaken. He heard voices that were painfully familiar. It was Molly's parents, that is, his mother-in-law and father-in-law, talking. Nancy was about to turn to appear in front of them to say hello, when suddenly he froze. Only now did the man realize what had initially caught his attention. The talkers were arguing among themselves, and quite loudly at that. And so Nancy became an unwilling listener to the family scandal. Should he have walked away, not eavesdropping for good measure? Probably, yes. That would have been the best option. But Nancy wanted to ask them how the children were, what the doctors were saying. So he decided to wait until the family conflict had exhausted itself. Needless to say, he had already started listening. And that was the real shock. What were they talking about? What were they discussing? What were they arguing about? The man was literally numb with horror. It seemed to him like it was happening in a dream. It couldn't be. Miranda yelled to her husband, "Christopher, don't you realize that Nancy could file for parole any day now?" And what did you think would happen then? The woman was angry. "I'm genuinely perplexed. What are you so worried about? What's gonna happen? Molly's gonna dump him. And that's the end of it. She gave it to him a long time ago, didn't she?" My father-in-law replied in the same tone. "It doesn't matter what you, me, or even Molly think. What matters is what Nancy thinks. Are you sure he thinks that Molly has paid him back?" Miranda's been getting more and more worked up. He lives there, trampling the zone day in and day out. Pardon my vulgarity. And believes he's welcome, that he's loved, that he's about to have children. Do you realize that? And what happens when the truth comes out, but will survive what they're already more calmly and even cynically answered Christopher to his wife? Yeah, just like that right away. Forgive and understand. You realize that we have postponed the catastrophe. I'm afraid to imagine what Nancy will do when he finds out that the picture has long been confused with his friend, behind his back even before that fatal accident. The woman was angry. Do you think he'll swallow that? I didn't say he'd quietly wave goodbye and get out of the lover's way. Of course, were we? Such a utopia should not be expected either, tried to reason calmly father-in-law. But what could he do? Will he find out and what? What I'm asking you back then. No, you're playing. He took the blame himself, so now he'll go to the police and say he's incriminated himself? Even if he did, who's going to believe him? Who's going to look into it? I don't know. but I don't think he won't try to punish his ex-wife and best friend. She found someone to cheat on her husband with. Stupid. And Steven's a good friend, of course. I'd kill them both if I were Nancy, to be honest. Bastards. If Molly wasn't my daughter, Miranda wouldn't be indebted. You've said that hundreds of times. You've written your opinion on the matter to everyone. Me, her, and even Steven. Thank you for not informing Nancy out of the best intentions, said her husband. I wish she had. A man sits, and for no reason. For our prank. And already she had been taken to task for it. That night did not sit quietly. Oh, Miranda, 100 times discussed. What now to pour from nothing to nothing? Song is our daughter, and we must protect her at all times, no matter what she expels, no matter what her faults. Christopher pointed out reasonably, and what am I doing? All I'm doing is protecting her, no matter how angry, no matter how infuriating. Only Nancy is very pathetic and wasting someone else's time. And everything else too, especially with those kids. Couldn't Molly and Steven have had offspring? A little later, when Nancy was free, when they'd have dotted their A's, poor guy thinks they're his kids. Believes, hopes. It's a good thing for him to get a sentence for having kids, especially two. Christopher sarcastically remarked, Does your cynicism, Christopher, have any limits? Miranda was indignant. I'm sorry, I'm just tired of the same thing. Enough, especially today. We're having grandchildren today, and we're going to dig in this mud again? My father-in-law exhaled. Yes, but you understand me too. I'm very worried. I can't live and not look back at the future, at what will be tomorrow, my mother-in-law explained tiredly. And it annoys me so much that you can all three of you, as if it's the right thing to do. Plus, it bothers me that you all seem to underestimate the scale of the catastrophe that hangs over us all. Miranda didn't give up. I hear you and I hear you. Still, let's call it a day and close this topic at least temporarily. Let's go to my daughters. The doctors are long gone. Must be interesting. She's having a C-section today. What did they decide in there anyway? Nancy began to hear footsteps moving away from him. Molly's parents continued to have some sort of dialogue of their own, but it no longer concerned him. What did he care if someone else's children were born to him today? The father-in-law and mother-in-law had long since left, and the son-in-law stood like a stumbling block, trying to comprehend every word the couple said. The word was not just such a waterfall of information at all. How many new things were suddenly known? Now that things had quieted down, it seemed to him, even in the moment, that it hadn't happened. What should he do? After all of what his wife's parents had said simply couldn't have happened in reality. Really, or was it? Nancy had been dealt a cruel blow. From a feeling of absolute happiness, he had slipped into the most terrible grief. It turned out that he had been betrayed by everyone, that the woman he loved had cheated on him with his best friend long ago, that this very friend Steven was also a traitor, that he had no children, that he had taken his spouse's guilt in vain, wasted a lot of his time, and acquired a stigma for life. It was unbelievable. It seemed absurd. You can't do that to a man without a heart. Nancy stood, without moving from the spot where he had heard the fatal conversation. He was trying to figure out what he should do now, how to proceed. There was an emptiness in his mind. One thing was clear in such a state, that Nancy was simply unable to think of anything useful. That meant that now was not the time for decisive action. I didn't want to see anyone. He wanted to be alone with himself and to think everything over, to systematize the information he had received, leaving the nurse's huge bouquet at the post. Silently, Nancy walked away without a backward glance. He was as powerless as if he were roofless. Molly's parents' talk had hit him too hard. What's in there? He had literally knocked the ground out from under his feet. For one moment, it seemed like he was the happiest man on earth. And then the next second, and he's got nothing, no one, except for his sick mom. So only Nancy still had her, leaving the hospital building and keeping the same political state. Nancy at first wandered just wherever he was going, because he had no purpose. He just didn't want to be there under the same roof with those people, cattle and traders anymore. To be honest, the man didn't even know where he should go now. The natural impulse was to go to his mother. Here, Betty will definitely be unspeakably happy to see her favorite son. But no, that was a bad idea. It's a terrible idea. How can he go to her sick woman in such a state? A mother is extremely perceptive. She'll know immediately that something's wrong. And what to say, how to tell her. Everything that's happened is impossible. Betty would ask about Molly's great-grandchildren. How do you lie without changing your face, without getting angry? No, absolutely not. I had a funny thought. Maybe I should go to my mother's cottage. Abandoned shacks are what we need right now. At least no one will find Nancy or bother her. Oh, it'll give you time to recover, think things over, no one to bother you. Right. The decision had been made. The man walked confidently to the subway, to get to the station and rush to the chosen address anywhere, as long as it was far away from people. That was his surprise. As a result, it wasn't him who gave it to him, but he did. What a surprise. I never would have imagined that such a thing was possible. His first day on the outside, free, the day he'd dreamed of. And what did he end up with? Nancy was all alone and crushed. No one knew he was here at all, and no one was waiting for him. No one needed him but his mother. A very terrible mockery of fate, unbelievable in its cruelty. The part came out leisurely in a commuter train. Nancy stared at the passing and dreary scenery outside the window and thought about his life. How come he had allowed himself to be treated like this? To have people close to him unashamedly wipe their feet on him? Taken advantage of? The questions were rhetorical, but pressing. It was necessary to give everything, to make some decisions, to act. And I didn't want to do anything. What was it all for? Why this struggle? Why? He was terribly afraid to admit it, even to himself. But what was there to act, if he didn't really want to live now? Everything appeared in a nightmarish black light, and there was not a single glimmer, not a single ray of light. Ikar Tiara Berita man had to have hope, something worth fighting for. Did he have any? It seemed he didn't. All life energy seemed to have run out, like a computer game. Nancy now clearly understood what it was like for people who decided to end their lives. It seemed that now he himself was learning that meaning. In the sad man's hands were the shards of his shattered life. Here it was, for a few more hours, whole and shiny. And he touched it, and the illusion was gone. Very poetic and high-minded, no doubt. But that's how he felt. His station. Nancy rose with difficulty, applying an incredible effort of will, and stepped onto the platform. No one around. What he needed like air. It was true that it would still be necessary to talk to people. It was necessary to buy some minimal set of food and necessary means. Nancy had nothing on him. He'd given everything away. Good thing he had cash. It's the same cash he took to court
that day. 212 years ago. At the local village store, Nancy couldn't resist taking a bottle of vodka. Yeah, he wanted to get drunk. He'd forgotten what it was like to drink now. He was terribly thirsty. If only to fall asleep, to pass out, trying to think things through on the way here. He realized today it only leads to dead ends. Worse, his decadent attitude might just simply lead to tragedy if he continues to push himself further. No, to hell with it. Today would just feel like passing out. the man pondered remorselessly. Tomorrow it's over. Tomorrow. Now only to get there, wash up, drink, and fall asleep dead asleep.
It would be good to have no dreams. That's exactly what he did. He came to the house, familiar from his childhood, which was even more crooked from time. I found a key under a barrel and opened the door. He didn't last long. Fortunately, fever and nervous tension had done their work. What bottle is there? Nancy barely had enough for a shot and immediately passed out. That was only better for him. According to the clock on his arm, he'd slept past 2 hours, and it seemed that he would never be able to get rid of the habit of going to bed at 10 and getting up at 6, as he was supposed to do, according to the internal regulations of the colony. How quickly life makes its adjustments. Just waking up, Nancy immediately realized that yesterday's mood had been lifted like a hand. All depression and despair were from stress and lack of sleep, from nerves that had been accumulating for so long. And now, the fall in life no longer seemed so sad and meaningless. On the contrary, Nancy wanted to act, wanted to seek justice, maybe even take revenge. And what was wrong with that? Everyone involved had been asking for it for a long time. It's just that patience isn't infinite. There are situations when it's criminal to be noble to yourself. There was no more confusion. It was gone. It was replaced by anger and rage. Nancy was angry at his spouse, his best friend, and even Molly's parents, especially his father-in-law. His calm voice echoed in his head and echoed the cynicism with which he'd interrupted his conversation with Miranda. Even though she had the rudiments of a conscience, the others didn't even have a hint. Everybody liked everything. Everybody was happy with everything. Deceived husband with full determination now pondered how he could get out of this situation with Nancy result, calculated his steps, possible response of his opponents. How do you get around all the obstacles? I wanted everything at once in the place of compensation, for Molly and Stephen to pay for everything they'd done. And that would be true justice. Except there's the big question at hand. How to achieve that is the big question, huh? Nancy decided to take some time off, to do the necessary routine. Maybe the thought would come to him. He busied himself with cooking, cleaning, and bathing. It was necessary to wash himself. A good deal of time passed behind all these chores. Simple labar, which did not require any brain effort, helped a lot. The questions themselves were spinning on the subcortex deep in the subconscious. Amazingly, it didn't take long to rack my brain. The solution came quickly. Nancy pushed on with what he had. It was more reliable. And indeed, he had 2 trump cards up his sleeve, and it was foolish to neglect it, not to use it. In the first place, no one knew that Nancy was already at large. Now he was thanking God that, despite his real desire to keep this secret for everyone, he had not surrendered under the pressure of emotion. Secondly, and more importantly, no one knew that he was already aware of the impending news and knew everything with which he was going to be ruined. It will not be possible to take him by surprise because his wife and best friend are counting on it. And it could have worked if Nancy hadn't been in the right place at the right time. It could be taken as a sign of fate. She's favoring him now. Apparently, Molly and Stephen had overstepped their bounds and overflowed the universe's patience. It's been a long time coming. And finally, luck was on Nancy's side. And then there was a third, most important, crucial circumstance. The fact is, at the time of that fatal accident, there was a video recorder in the car, and it was working. Molly, of course, not puzzled, but such settings were laid automatically. The engine was switched on, followed immediately by automatic switching on and filming itself. His spouse knew about it, so he hid the device before the police arrived. He succeeded, for it could be heard and even partly seen that it was not Nancy who was driving the car. He promised Molly after Ward that he would destroy the tapie. When he promised, he believed it. But he didn't. He kept it in a safe place. Why? Nancy couldn't have explained it then. He knew he wouldn't have used it against Molly if she'd just abandoned him, left him alone to deal with what had happened. It was a very real possibility then, but it wasn't scary. Then why? Why are you asking for it? By yourself? The ghost prompted, but whispered. Or a little simpler, without mysticism. Even then, Nancy knew in his gut that Molly was not to be trusted. She was worthy of his trust and love enough to take the blame for her crime, but not so much that he couldn't leave trumps behind, couldn't reinsure, for worse. And now, it's not for nothing. It's scriptural. It'll come in handy. Now, this record would serve him well. The man had no doubt, so it was quite clear what to do with Molly. How to press her and with what. The husband had already figured out in his head what he wanted to achieve, what would be the most painful for Molly. So he had a revenge plan for her already matured in his head. And then there's the best friend. What to do with him? How do you hurt him in a way that hurts, and scares him? How to hurt the feelings of Stephen, who dared to betray the sacred male friendship? After all, you can't just let it go down like that. Leave it unpunished. The Chinese famous formula, expressed in the resume, no longer worked. What was it if you catch the Tiazu accurately? If someone has wronged you on the spot, sit on the bank of a river and soon you will see the corpse of your enemy floating past you. No. The idea needed a no-age twist. Nancy knew. Now he knew for sure. For sure. If a man did you wrong and you let him off the hook, forgive him. He'll do it again. Evil is an extremely corrupting force, which is why it demands punishment and vengeance. Stephen was a lot worse for the plan. The ex-friend had another thing in mind in his planning. Namely, what would hurt Stephen the most? What would hurt him the most? And when the question was put in this way, the answer was not long in coming. Memories came flooding back to Nancy. The fact was that at once a moment from the common past of friends came to mind how much Stephen had suffered in his divorce from his ex-wife. It goes without saying that it was not moral suffering, not love wailing, not given feelings of a man in love. Everything was much more petty and prosaic. Friend understood the financial aspect of divorce. Yes. The man was extremely puzzled that the ex-wife did not get anything of his capital. It's my money. What does she have to do with it? Stefan resented and lamented at the time. Well, it has everything to do with it. Adriana provided for you, bore your children. Isn't that a contribution to your life? Nancy tried to reason with his friend at the time. Hell no. You're weak in the head. I was working like Pippa Carlo, and she was busy with herself and didn't deny herself anything. There was no point in arguing, though there was plenty to argue with. Nancy already knew for certain that the one who did not deny himself anything was Stephen himself, who cheated left and right and was a disgusting husband. How only Adriana had put up with him for so long. Anyway, Stephen had his own way of doing things. It was despicable, to be honest. He simply hid the assets and money from the marriage, transferred it all to a front man, and moved it offshore. He even bragged then, "Look how radical it is to solve the problem." And even then, my friend couldn't help but speak his mind. It's not like that. Not at all, brother. You can't do that. Adriana didn't do anything to you to put her face on the table like that. Nancy tried to persuade his comrade, but to no avail. Stephen was not prepared to be a constructive despot. He had taken a position, and there was no moving him from it. He thought he was doing the only right thing, in a very reasonable and, most importantly, honest and sincere way, as if perplexed as to why he should share. Therein, of course, lies life's unfathomable mystery. How only such people manage to convince themselves that this is not meanness, How do they manage to agree with their conscience? It's just amazing.
And Nancy, importantly, is no better.
The cowardly one had remained silent, siding with his friend rather than with Adriana, who was clearly the aggrieved party. Now, apparently, was the time to correct previous mistakes at the same time.
The fact is that Nancy knew how to find the offshore locations where the couple's marital funds were stored, knew how to get them out of there, and was certainly willing to share that with Adriana. Is that petty? No, he didn't think so. It's an act of justice. It was the right thing to do in good conscience. But what now? The main thing was to admit to himself that he'd been a fool. When everything was finally settled in his head, when the plans were finally ready, he could go to bed. It was late evening. It was good to be out in the open air. Nancy did not want to waste time, and the next morning he started to realize his ideas. The moment was not to be missed. The longer he delayed, the more likely it was that his wife would grab him in time. If he didn't have enough strength already and started calling the colony. That way, the surprise effect would be lost. Stupid. The only hope is that Molly did give birth on that unfortunate day. That she had an emergency C-section, as parents said, and she was not to her ex-husband, at least not to the play. So all day long, the man had been very busy. Had to check everything carefully, thoroughly, to see if anything had changed. But no. Having access to the internet of the local neighborhood library, Nancy checked. No money had been withdrawn, so Stephen was still afraid Adriana would claim it? Great! That's just great. Had to drive over to the stash house to check the DVR. Everything was in order here. The machinery was working. The recording was quite clear and intelligible, just as Nancy had remembered back then. But there was no way. It was worth making sure. It was foolish to act rashly at a time like this. There was too much at stake. So now what? It was time to act. Now, the production was dragging on. And any minute now. The situation could have become critical. Early in the morning, Nancy jumped on the electric train as planned. He was on his way to Molly's hospital. It was time to talk to her. Many topics of conversation had accumulated. Her parents had not been seen paying, apparently coming later. That's even better. The conversation would be confidential. The ward nurse bumped into the man and asked sternly, "Who are you?" "Who?" "I'm Molly Wilson," Nancy confessed in confidence. "And who are you to her? Who do you come as?" The girl persisted. The husband displayed a look of terrible embarrassment and excitement on the medical woman's face. "Husband?" she asked again. That's right." There were no more obstacles on the way, but the girl's reaction clearly hinted at itself. And here, Molly's husband and the father of her children was a very different man. I wondered if he'd meet Stephen here too. No, there was only one new mother in a separate room. The children were not to be seen either. Nancy didn't care for the spectacle, so he simply created the door and entered with a routine greeting of, "Hello, Molly," jumped up on the bed and immediately jerked in pain with a hide in her face, obviously still recovering from the surgery. The woman's eyes nearly popped out of her orbits in surprise. "Nancy, how are you?" The wife was genuinely surprised. "I'm so glad you've come." "I'm so glad." It was fake and interesting enough. If he did not know the whole truth now, he would have believed it and would not have suspected deceit. What the hell did it matter anymore? Nancy stooped down in the chair that stood 1.5 meters away from his spouse's hospital bed. "You won't even come near me. Give me a hug or a kiss." "Oh, Molly, really? I'm ashamed to hear that." Her ears wilted. Quietly and peacefully, her husband put her in her place. "I know everything, my darling. Everything." Molly's eyes widened, but she didn't give up. "What do you know?" "I don't understand." A confused... Fused wife! I know who you really had children with. I know you cheated on me with my best friend before the accident. That's enough. The woman's face changed. At first, it was as if she was paralyzed with fear. She won. Then, the tears came. She didn't even try to wipe them away. Nancy, I'm so sorry. Am I? Stop. Her husband interrupted her immediately. I'm not interested in your excuses. And that's when Molly underwent a dramatic change. She went from quiet hysteria and panic to aggression in a second. Why did you come here then? Screamed the wife. What did you want to say to me? What are you going to do to me? That's what he was expecting. I saved the DVR footage, the man grinned. At first it seemed that she didn't quite get the meaning of his words, but that there was a pause for a few seconds. Here on Molly's face is no longer anger, confusion, and doubt. What a kaleidoscope! I don't believe you. You destroyed the tape. You promised me. Helplessly, she screamed again. Okay. Without another word, he took his smartphone out of his pocket and went into the gallery, found the file he wanted, and set it to play. Look, please. There could be no doubt now. Of course, he wasn't thinking of bluffing. What do you want? Her first sentence today sounded without emotion. No dancing colors. Maybe it sounded humble, but like what? Justice. Molly, you owe me one. Don't you think I plan on hitting you where it hurts? He noticed Molly's body clenched. Oh, no, don't worry. Not on the kids. It's too much. I'm not you or Steven. Are you? Your most precious possession is money. I'd like to think it's your second highest priority now. But whatever. So here's what I want specifically. I'm not satisfied with splitting the jointly acquired property in half. I want everything by deed of gift immediately, but it's either that or a police record. It's your choice, of course, which is it. Yeah, this is extortion. I'll report you myself. Who's gonna believe you, Zek? Molly exploded again. Lots of people will believe me. There's proof, all of it. That's true, by the way. But here I am, personally aware that it is not extortion to demand the transfer of money or property under threat of reporting a crime. Judicial practice proceeds from the postulate, and there was nothing to commit a crime, so I'm not in any danger. Did you really think I'd let you put me in juvie a second time? For nothing. No, my dear, if you don't agree to my terms, you'll have to serve a second time for the same thing. A third? Molly, I think she's got your girl in her, who doesn't like the fact that she's been pinned down. Why the second? I did one time, you'll do one time. You hit a man? Hey, you're gonna have to answer to the full extent of the law. What's that got to do with it? That there was a conspiracy on my part? Nancy calmly explained and laid it all out. Don't even think about it, Molly. You're not gonna get away with it this time. It's either or. And I've already laid out all your options. Don't you feel sorry for my kids? Are you really such a freak? Molly is back to being aggressive and insulting to her spouse. It's true that everyone thinks everyone else is a freak, even though they're a freak themselves. Classic. It's my fault, too. Hilarious. I marveled at Nancy's wife's ingenuity. No, I don't feel sorry for your children. They won't starve to death. But they'll have plenty to do besides feed them. But how will I manage without money? Are you trying to push pity on me now? I am. You don't think I've done enough for you? But here's the truth, Molly. Don't even start that. It just pisses me off completely. The kids have a father who's a jerk, but you chose him. You have parents. Will they help? You're not gonna die. Do something about it. Seeing that his wife was preparing a new stupid argument, Nancy stopped her with a gesture. Immediately. No, whatever else you want to tell me. I've wasted too much time on you as it is. There will either be a donation within 2 days, or the tape will go to law enforcement. This conversation is over. What do you think 2 days is? I'm in the hospital after surgery, and the hospital has notaries coming and going. Don't worry, smirked Nancy, and headed for the exit. You've got 48 TR from now on waiting, and I'm not bluffing. Tired. Call me if you need anything. The number's the same. Without giving Molly a second thought, he walked out. Further conversation was still very little constructive, and a lot of emotions and mutual reproaches. This was very much not to be desired. Of course, Nancy realized that as soon as the door closed behind him, Molly would immediately start calling Stephen, and he would try to intervene in the situation. That was an excuse not to delay the second part of the Marlis and ballet, but to get right down to the action. We had to go to Adriana and talk to her. While strange as it may seem, this was what Nancy dreaded most of all. With his wife, it was clear that he had been betrayed, and he demanded justice and vengeance. In that situation, everyone was wrong but him. But here, he would have to confess to morally questionable actions. It was unpleasant to face himself in such an unfavorable light. But there was nothing to be done. Strangely enough, Adriana had no grudge against Nancy at all. All her anger, and righteous anger, was directed at her former spouse. What was your fault? She wondered. Covered for him, knew it was wrong. And not turning him in right away was despicable. You should have acted according to your conscience right away, Nancy confessed honestly. In response, Adriana just waved her hand, saying it was nothing. In response, the spouse's former best friend detailed everything he knew. He explained how she could succeed in the case of dividing the marital money, how she could fairly take her half of what was legally due to her and the children. How pleased Adriana was. How grateful, honestly. Nancy was terribly embarrassed to hear these pleasant words. The residue remained in her soul the moment the man approached his stepfather's house to see his mother. He received a call back from Molly. Listening into the receiver, sobs were heard first. I agree. Are you happy? No. Why would I be? Nancy was puzzled. You understand, I have everything with anger and even rage in my voice, explained the spouse. That is, everything for you is money. You still have your children, beloved parents. But that's not enough for you. To answer, apparently, there was nothing. Yes, by the way, let's immediately solve the issues with the children. The husband took the floor again. We're still married. I don't want someone else's paternity on me. Okay. Okay? Again, as if to show Molly, sobs when? Why put it off? Can we call a notary tomorrow? The husband was quick. He wanted to get it over with. Why are you so cruel, Nancy? The wife cried loudly. Development. I don't feel sorry for you at all. He was astonished at such insolence. I wonder if there are any limits at all. Yes, you were right to mock. I thought I told you not to push, Petit, but I'm not trying to. It's useless. Now I know you very well, and all these numbers I'm getting goats. Practice on your own kids, will you? But he's not the one who's leaving me destitute. Molly's the one who got the ball rolling, so he didn't do time for you. The husband didn't stay in debt. Or is that not enough? I think it's equal to a trade. If I had known, she said with anger and pressure, nothing would have changed, except that you would have made sure that I destroyed the video recorders. The record of the accident would not let it go to waste. That's what I'll believe. Stop badgering me. I'm waiting for the notary's text message. And remember the time. Not wanting to hear a batch of new comments from Nancy S.'s wife. Connected. He smirked. This was his little victory. It wasn't even the money that pleased him. It was the fact that he had managed to find Molly's pain point. To push there, that made him very happy. Victory! Not 10 minutes later, Nancy's phone rang again. I'm unheard of. He laughed nervously. It was Stephen himself, of course. Hello. Nancy began the conversation with a feigned courtesy. But you? Stephen was not at all shy in his expressions. In his impotent anger, he went through almost the entire vocabulary. Is there anything else to say? Or I, connecting only on the merits. This time, Nancy coldly cold tone interrupted the angry tirade of the man. On the merits, of course there is. Not only are you blackmailing Molly, but Adriana is denouncing me, Stephen yelled. You know the ex-best friend was remarkably calm. It amazes me how you and Molly think you have the right to sway me. You slept with my wife behind my back, and now she's given birth to you. And it's my fault. I'm shocked, honestly. Or that you really expected me to be submissive and humble. Nancy grinned. There was no answer, of course, but Stephen was not long confused and simply changed the subject. I don't care, actually helped someone with it, just gave Marianka false hope. I'll take it all out again. That's the whole conversation. You could hear the smug tone in my friend's voice. It's the same thing again, Molly. What do you think? Since I trusted you, I am such a fool that now I did not calculate all the steps forward on the media, and you will learn the true meaning of the word snitch. I've got all kinds of interesting documents saved. Don't you remember how many times you asked me to check your gray and black reporting? All these papers will immediately be in the tax office, the prosecutor's office, and naturally, the Economic Security Department. You want to like the prospect. What do you want from me? Whispered Stephen. You want money? Yes? I want vengeance. And justice. In this particular case, for Adriana, for you, fool, I'm trying to do the right thing for once in my life, even if it's under duress. Give her her rightful half, her and her children, your own damn children. A righteous man lingered. None of your business. I'm warning you. I'm in touch with Adriana. Try anything, and you'll be in my shoes, in the departure zone. Only, you're for what you've done, not for someone else's sins. Half is a lot. Stephen must have decided that this is a bargaining situation. Stupid. Stephen, but the choice is either, or there's no other option. Don't lose. Nancy pressed the disconnect button. These conversations made him terribly tired and terribly pissed off. How had he not seen before what kind of people were around him? It was just blinding? All right, one must leave the acts of self-abuse. Now, Nancy was in a hurry to see his mother. That's who would warm him up and help him with the burden on his soul. His own mommy. It's good that he has her. It's already so precious and valuable. Even one person who loves you, on whom you can rely without looking back, is already a luxury. At least this meeting went as expected, without any surprises. Betty cried with happiness when she saw her own son. I've waited, she whispered, wiping away her tears of happiness. My son, how glad I am that you are here, my darling. Nancy stayed with her. He didn't want to leave his mother for a minute. I wanted to savor the warmth and love that was between them. One can't brush off such a blow now, as in one's youth and foolishness. Only from the height of lived years, one can understand and appreciate that parents are the only ones who love us. Certainly, there will be no more of that in life. Otherwise, all of Nancy's plans were fully realized. A week later, everything was over, and it went the way he wanted it to. Now, all the jointly acquired property in the marriage with Molly was completely in his hands. Officially, the man was already dealing with bureaucratic delays. To make the process go faster, the legal paperwork was taking a lot of time, but he knew how to wait. Things were progressing well with Adriana. Nancy called her several times to check whether she was meeting with fierce resistance from her ex-husband. Alas, no. No way. Thank you so much. I don't know what you told him or threatened him with. But now Stephen is being quieter than ever. No threats, no insults. I'm just marveling, the woman reported emotionally. And good. If you need anything, be sure to call me. Of course, thank you again. And it's changing my kids. Nancy did not feel at all worthy of praise and gratitude, but he was very glad that at least now he had done the right thing. It's never too late to correct mistakes, because that's how they are the satisfied faces of Molly's parents, herself and Stephen. It is sweet to the eye. Nancy's whole look expressed disdain and disgust. It was all that was now available to them to silently throw disgruntled glances. And Nancy was triumphant within himself? Yes, he showed it outwardly with pleasure too. Why not? Why should he be sad? Now the worst of it was really over for him. He was rid of such ballast of traitors and scoundrels, leaving them alone with each other, writhing and powerless to hate. Wonderful. It was now more than 3 months since Nancy had been at large. Enough time had passed since those disgusting filler events. Then, in a moment of surprise, Nancy had considered them tragic and had seen them as the end of the world. Now, however, he thanked God every day that it had all happened this way. It's scary to imagine what could have been different. Now, Nancy lives life to the fullest, unencumbered by unnecessary people, and tries not to think about the past, stares into the future, does not want to think and constantly musing about his mistakes, miscalculations, vain deeds, excessive trust in seemingly close people. He had to draw conclusions, learn from this bitter experience, and move on. In general, he wanted to think that he had fixed everything, and punished the guilty, restored justice, perhaps even took revenge. Demonstrated that you can't do that to people, the consequences would still come. It was very happy and warmed his soul that he had corrected his own mistake, his unflattering deed, helped Adriana to restore her rights. It was uplifting. All was not in vain. Nancy had been able to help more than just himself, per se. Now Nancy still had a lot to thoroughly work through, to understand, to evaluate. A lot more time is needed. Wounds don't heal in such a short time. But even now, he does not vow and does not put a cross on himself. He believes that perhaps he will meet a woman again and will be able to love and trust again. It's still only too bitter. Need more time to finally come to his senses.